Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. The Pharmacy Inspection Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, delivering quality and meaningful conversations and discussions about our pharmacy industry and the critical role pharmacists play in our healthcare systems. Learn more at pharmacypodcast.com. Please welcome your hosts, Brian Prince and Seth DePasquale.
Hello, compounding pharmacy friends and colleagues. Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where every week we discuss topics related exclusively to compounding pharmacy. We're always trying to bring guests on the show that have a different insight and unique perspective into some facet of compounding pharmacy. And this week we speak with Brenda Jensen and Jim Hack of Compounding Consultants. They began their pharmacy careers at an Air Force base and now consult pharmacies large and small on compounding technique, procedures, and most importantly, operating a compliant pharmacy, not for the sake of checking a box, but for keeping people and preparations safe. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Jim and Brenda. Brenda, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself and Compounding Consultants?
I'm Brenda Jensen. Jim and I are both pharmacy technicians. We started our careers together as pharmacy specialists in the Air Force at Homestead, Florida. I've been involved in compounding one way or another since then, except for a short period when I owned a non-compounding retail pharmacy. I got started in consulting by accident. I was helping the compounding pharmacy that I worked for go through accreditation. During the survey, the surveyor commented that I should help others with accreditation. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but a few weeks later, someone called and asked if I would help them. It ended up being a friend of my boss. He told his friends, and it kind of took off from there. So now we've helped about 250 pharmacies in 45 states improve compounding quality and safety, as well as comply with state law and that sort of thing. In addition to consulting, I also fill in as a pharmacy technician at a critical access hospital in South Dakota.
And just so you guys know, Brenda is the brains of the operation. But I joined with Brenda in 2013. We were in the Air Force together, and after I got discharged from the Air Force, I went and worked in oncology and nuclear pharmacy for a few years, and then started my own business helping oncologists with safety and cost effectiveness, providing chemotherapy to their patients in their offices versus having to have the patient be admitted to the hospital, the doctor having to go to the hospital, not being able to bring their staff over, things like that. I just saw a need there, and it worked out. It was overseen by the medical board, not the pharmacy board, but it's the same thing. I set up and managed chemotherapy preparations in 5 physicians' offices in Orlando area, and it just blossomed and boomed from there. In an effort to help them with their pricing and their issues they had day to day, besides, the normal problems that we have with compliance, I formed a GPO that eventually helped them with purchasing power from major wholesalers. And I took a little break from that and left the pharmacy world to follow my son. I got lucky. He's actually a professional golfer on the PGA Tour, so I followed him around a little bit and played dad for a while. And since joining Brenda at Compounding Consultants, my focus has been to help her in a way that I can help with hands-on training, from her coming in on the side of telling me the knowledge and what we need to do and how we need to comply, that I can go in and make sure that the compounding personnel can understand what they're doing, how to do it, and what works best cost effectively to get them to safety and compliance and make everybody happy.
The reason we started this podcast was to keep raising the bar for quality and safety in compounding pharmacy. And that is really at the core of your business model as well, helping pharmacies become accredited. So what are the advantages of compounding pharmacies getting accredited?
Accreditation shows that a compounding pharmacy complies with a minimum quality standard. Sometimes accreditation is required in order for a pharmacy to receive a non-resident pharmacy license or in order to be paid by a third-party carrier. The main benefit, though, as I see it, is knowing that the pharmacy has met this minimum quality standard, which is confirmed by an outside party. There's nothing like having a second set of eyes on your compounding practice. This is a benefit not only to the pharmacy personnel, but also patients and prescribers. The regulatory environment has undergone a lot of changes in the last few years, and this is a way to ensure that a pharmacy has kept up with these changes and will continue to do so. And as patients and prescribers become more knowledgeable and understand the value of accreditation, this is going to become increasingly important.
And on my side of it, even though we started off helping community pharmacies with accreditations, our business model has kind of evolved over time, basically learning and seeing what people need from being in all these pharmacies. That we've added community pharmacies where we're helping them, we're going into hospitals now, infusion centers, physician practices, anything involved in that whole circle to actually help the patients and put out a good product with compliance and safety and keep up with these regulatory things. I wanted to say about half of the people that we are helping now are seeking accreditation. So about 50% of the model is helping them with a variety of other reasons, whether they're trying to keep their states happy or others are going through some sort of credentialing program. We also provide on-site sterile and non-sterile compounding training so the compounding personnel can learn with their own equipment in their own environment and complying and help be, quality and safety issues in their own facility.
It's refreshing to know that 50% of the pharmacies that you consult for are genuinely concerned about the quality and the safety. That's very warming. I think I met you two in Houston at a conference, probably, I'm thinking it was about 2013. And at that time, I was there talking on safety as it relates to workflow and chemical handling, more so, with the dry powders, because I tell folks all the time that if there's going to be an exposure to personnel and to the environment, more times than not, it's actually going to happen on the non-sterile side, just simply based on the volume of product that's being handled on that side. And so you and I, we struck up many conversations over the years at conferences, and we've talked about some of the things that you see and then some of the things that I saw. And so why don't you, for our listeners, tell us where do you see some of the areas in both non-sterile and sterile that you see pharmacies kind of struggle with that you pinpoint and you go after that?
Okay, well, from a broader perspective, we found that compounding personnel often have difficulty even interpreting the regulations and standards that they're supposed to be meeting. So that's the starting point. They must often comply with these regulations and standards from multiple organizations, and the rules don't always align. So they have to prioritize who they're trying to keep happy. As far as specific things for sterile and non-sterile compounders, documentation is probably the biggest issue. Having a lack or inadequate documentation. This may include SOPs that do not exist or do not reflect current practices, incomplete master formulation records or compounding records, incomplete documentation of training and competency, incomplete cleaning and calibration logs. You want to touch on some specific sterile and non-sterile things, Jim?
Yeah, the things I see, it comes from a different perspective. The compounding staff, they don't understand the importance of following the consistent processes, their methods. They don't understand the why of what they're doing. Is it accomplishing what they needed to do to get to that end goal? They don't understand why they're required to do something. And I think part of that is if we can understand it and understand what those questions are or those regulations are, it's easier to comply and make it happen on our end. I also see, the compounders that'll deviate from their processes because it maybe saves a little time or it's a little easier or it's a cost savings, but they don't understand that deviation, it could put the pharmacy out of compliance or produce an inconsistent preparation. It's all about education and understanding why we're doing what we're doing. Another major issue is that the regulators in the accreditations or the credentialing surveyors, they emphasize, your basic processes. And the basic process is that many compounders perform out of habit but don't pay much attention to. So for the sterile side, that would include like hand hygiene, garbing, aseptic technique, just plain cleaning the hood in the clean room. For non-sterile, you could look at the same thing, garbing, but how to operate the balancer, their equipment, mixing preparations, using principles of geometric dilution and understanding why we still do that and how to do it. That all those processes would help them reduce, the risk.
Yeah, one of the common areas that I have seen that both the FDA has spoke specifically to, as well as say like the ACHC, and there's this common ground. The things that are missing are employee proficiency, employee competency assessments, and that documentation. So those two organizations, one comes from one end of the regulatory, and then one comes from the accreditation, and then somewhere in the middle, they have a tendency, they agree that employee competency is a big deal. Would you agree with that assessment as well?
Absolutely. Time is a problem. We often see that the pharmacist in charge is trying to do everything on his or her own, or pharmacy personnel are designating time at the end of the day, and then they get caught up in patient needs, so don't have, run out of time at the end of the day. But just training and competency in general is a weakness. They maybe have some minimal training, but there's no documentation of that training, and they don't understand the difference between training and competency.
Yeah, you guys had touched on something that really resonates with me quite a bit, and I talk about this all the time, is people not understanding the why behind things. Specifically in sterile compounding, which is sort of my wheelhouse, it just, you ask people certain probing questions about the difference between sterilization and depyrogenation and why you do that. They just don't, there's nothing behind their knowledge that supports why they're doing that. So it's definitely a lack of training and education that I don't even really feel like is available currently, unfortunately. At least not in any continuing education program that I've ever seen. What are the things that when you go into a pharmacy, and you maybe touched on this a little bit, what are the things you pretty much focus on with every pharmacy that you consult with, or is there a common thread there?
There is a common thread, and Jim and I have separate roles when we go into a pharmacy. I look at their policies and procedures, their documentation, their training records, their quality program, and make sure that that's all in line. Jim does the hands-on part, so he can walk you through some of what he does.
Well, for me, it's the same thing. It's getting the people to understand, and you guys have said it perfectly, because that's my big thing, is the why. Ask yourself why. Why am I doing this? Does it serve the purpose of what I'm trying to get it to do? And understand that process and how that affects the whole method of where we're trying to go, the end goal. And then we get that down, and obviously, with documentation that Brenda checks and goes, we can prove that, yes, that works, and I did that. So now that's, it's McDonaldizing, right? We want to keep that compound, that method the same way every time, because we proved that what we're doing works. And that's the toughest thing, to get them to understand how and why, and the big thing is the why. You mentioned something on education, and we don't educate. I think we do educate. I don't think we can do an education to the same way to all the personnel. Everybody has different personalities, different thoughts, different ways of thinking and understanding and remembering. And I think that's the thing that Brenda and I do really well, is coming in and understanding the personnel and really making sure that they're getting what you're teaching them. And it's different everywhere you go.
It can be an overwhelming process, and people think that they can just go and learn it and be done. But it's not. It's continuous. Reading 797, you get something different out of it every time you read it. So it's not a one and done deal. It should be something that's ongoing.
Brenda, you certainly nailed it every time. And I have lived inside of the 800 chapter, and you actually corrected me on a point last time we were together and we were talking about something. And you made the point, and I agree with you, is it doesn't matter how many times sometimes you read through that chapter, whether it's 797 or 1066 or whatever, whatever chapter within the compounding compendium, is something else comes out, and then something else resonates, and then it incurs another question. I know this week I had one of those questions that's not actually answered in the chapter, is that once we get into hazardous drug handling and we finish pre-sterilization weighing, which again is that high risk, should we back out and redo hand hygiene, or is it surgical scrub, or what's the efficient process? And so after asking a handful of people, it's a split 50-50, because there are those intimate details that are just not in the chapter as part of those workflow components. And so, Jim, I was going to rewind with you just for a second. You were talking earlier about consistency in the McDonaldization. And I don't know if you've seen that movie, The Founder, but I talked about that in weeks previous. I was on a flight not too long ago, and The Founder is the story of Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's. And it showed the McDonald brothers, and they worked meticulously to build a consistent process where they actually went out to a tennis court with chalk. They drew out the kitchen, they scrubbed it, they drew it out again, and they had the guys actually rotating around each other to see who was going to bump into each other. But what they did is they created a process. And then in weeks previous, we also had a guest by the name of Javon Coleman, and he actually is a process improvement person. And just there's a lot that can be a takeaway from process improvement. But I was wondering, Jim, do you have a specific example of the consistencies that you speak of?
It's a method, and like I said, it could be. I always do this Coke and Pepsi model. We know that we both can drink Coke or Pepsi, and if it works for you, then there isn't a state that tells you I have to use Coke or I have to use Pepsi. It's the method. I have to get to a soda or whatever it is. It's hard to explain. Tell me more, Brian, of what your question. What is your question you're trying to get to?
I have some input here. Jim, explain how you teach someone how their workflow in the hood, so that they know what part of the process they're in and they don't have mix-ups.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's a great one to do. One thing that I came up with from 22 years in the hood is we all get busy. We all have 10,000 things going on, but that technician or that pharmacist in the sterile side, one of the great things is if we do everything the same way for that formula, no matter if we stop and get a tap on the window or somebody's calling on the phone intercom to ask a question about another patient or another, compound, you can back away, you can take care of that situation, and I can go back to my hood, knowing all my, things of changing my gloves or doing whatever it is that I have to do based on what I just ended up doing. But now I look at the hood, and in 2 seconds, I can tell what I've done and where I'm at based on those vials and everything being where it needs to be every time the same way for that formula. And it really sounds simple, but it's a time saver and it's a risk saver.
Seth, actually engaging in the sterile compounding process yourself, you're a hands-on pharmacist there in your particular clean room. Does that resonate with you, with the consistency of the process that Jim is explaining?
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm not sure if I've ever explained this, but this is the simplest example I can think of. If you have a scale or balance that you're limited with how much weight you're able to measure out. The pharmacist I used to work with here at BT, she would go in and measure something out and then just dump it in a bigger container and put another weigh boat on the balance and then weigh the next one. Well, you get 3 or 4 into that, and she would say, "Do you know what number I was on?" And I'd be like, "No." I was like, "Why don't you just take the weigh boats and put them off to the side as you weigh them, and that way you'll know exactly what number you're on." And she was like, "Oh, that's a good idea." I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, it's really simple, but it's a visual cue for the person to know, like, oh, this is where I'm at, and there's no way I can mess this up. I try to think about that in everything I'm doing, just like along the lines of what Jim said. If you're consistently setting up a procedure the same exact way every single time, depending on what like Jim was saying, you flash off to one other thing, then you come back and you're like, oh yeah, okay, so I have, this scene going on, and I recognize where I'm at in the process, and I can just step right back into it as if nothing had ever happened. Yeah, that's really important. Another thing I was gonna mention is that with Javad, when we were talking about taking out all the value added or non-value added things in any kind of procedure, you're essentially taking out the wastes in any process or procedure. And an efficient process is one that you probably also won't make too many mistakes on because it's consistent, it's lean. So I think there's so many ideas that are clicking in my head and hopefully in others about how all this works and how you can bring it all together in your own pharmacy practice. None of this stuff I think is really Einsteinish or anything, but it takes a little bit of thought and just sit down and be a little introspective on it. So yeah, I think you guys have pointed out a lot of really cool, great ideas already.
Well, simplicity is key with the workflow process, and I'm sure Jim will agree with that. And I've had a lot of opportunity to really think about some of the things that Javaz has brought up about cutting out some of the non-value added activity, and so I'll relate that to safety as well, because if you think about it, and the first thing that I teach a technician is the process of staging. That is number one. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the formulation record. How many chemicals? How many weigh boats? How many utensils? Do I need my capsule plate? Do I need my, something to triturate with? Do I need a mortar and pestle? Do I need glassware? And we really think through the entire process before we actually engage in it. And by doing that, we have effectively staged. And by effectively staging, we're not creating unnecessary activity, which is walking back and forth. Say, well, I forgot a piece of glassware. I forgot the tamper for the capsule plates. But also by doing that, by cutting out that unnecessary activity, we also cut out the unnecessary breaching of containment, which is also environmental exposure and personnel exposure. So to me, I'm just having to step back and think through workflow process. It's like, wait a minute, it's unnecessary and it's unsafe. And so I wanted to wrap those concepts together and share that with the audience there.
We're coming into the end of January, and we probably won't be able to say Happy New Year's for too much longer, but we've been asking our guests, what New Year's advice do you have for compounding pharmacies and pharmacists or technicians do you have going forward for 2018? And specifically for you guys, what advice do you guys have for them in terms of getting accredited in 2018?
Compliance doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing process, and you're never really there. The process can initially seem overwhelming, so the first step would be to perform a gap analysis to uncover areas of weakness. Once you do that, create a plan of correction and start tackling deficiencies. Set weekly goals, communicate these goals to staff. Set time aside at the beginning of the day so that you don't get through the day and find out that you're at the end of another day with no progress. You need to make compliance a priority, not an afterthought, I guess is the basic idea.
And for me to add to what Brenda just said, I agree with her 1,000%. But we need to understand that you need to get everybody involved. It's a group team effort. The whole pharmacy has a key role in this. Compounding personnel, they're more likely to comply if they have thorough understanding of the process and what we're trying to do and how they fit into the big picture. Delegate tasks accordingly to your employees, to their strengths. For example, a detail-oriented technician may help with the compliance audits. Someone that really likes to clean, put them in charge of cleaning duties. Compounding technicians, they work every day and do their job, and they do it well for the most part. They can help identify the there's changes that might be done to the SOPs or the master formulation records. They're looking at them every day. You can always improve them. It's a process that's never done. And understand that whether it takes 3 months or 3 years, every effort we make towards compliance, it's definitely going to increase quality and safety for the compounding practice.
That is a good way to wrap it up, because you're right. Every person that works inside of the compounding pharmacy is what we call a stakeholder. Whether you're doing the risk assessment, whether you're doing a gap analysis, whatever process you're doing, every person has a voice, and because every person's voice has a different opinion or a different stake in the game. And so I love when people feel like they're intimately involved in the process, and when new procedures are written or when new processes evolve. I love it when the technicians feel like they were the ones that helped create that, because then you get true buy-in, and that's where team really happens, as a buy-in. The last comment that I'll make in closing out this week's podcast is that everyone in the pharmacy should share ownership for solutions. And let me repeat a great point that Jim made earlier about consistency. He said whether it takes 3 months or 3 years, every effort that we make towards compliance definitely increases quality and safety. So thank you, Brenda Jensen and Jim Hack, for joining us this week on the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast. And to our listeners, if your pharmacy needs help with compliance solutions, writing SOPs, accreditation preparation, go to their website, which is compoundconsults.com, and you can contact them there. So this is another great week, another great episode. Until we meet again, keep raising the bar.